What could force a holiday-packed Airbus A320 to halt on a London runway in the space of a heartbeat? And why did the paper trail bury the most unsettling clue? On 20th of January 2000, Airtours International's G-VCED lined up for a routine departure that was anything but. In the cockpit, a split-second decision separated escape from catastrophe. In the cabin, passengers felt the aircraft's mood turn from confident to brittle. Within minutes, Gatwick's precision choreography faltered, emergency crews converged, and a quiet investigation began. 2 decades on, the data, the voices, and the design philosophy behind Airbus's most ubiquitous jet tell a story that was never meant to be dramatic. Until it was. This is the anatomy of a near miss you likely never heard about, and the uncomfortable lessons it still forces on winter morning departures. The first light over Gatwick on 20th of January 2000 was more suggestion than sunrise, a pewter glow that turned frost into a thin sheen on tarmac and wing. The airport's first wave was already in motion, a choreography of tug drivers, loaders, and cabin crews working against the clock of assigned slots. At stand, Airtours International's Airbus A320-231, registration G-VCED, sat with its APU humming, a clean white fuselage beating with meltwater from cabin heat meeting sub-zero air. Inside, the atmosphere was brisk but buoyant. Families in fleece and trainers, couples nursing takeaway coffees, a preschooler mesmerized by the blinking wingtip. This was a routine charter to sun, sand, and forgettable paperbacks, the sort of flight Gatwick could dispatch in its sleep. Until any winter morning proves otherwise, airport logs from that dawn show temperatures hovering around freezing with a light northerly and a low, stubborn ceiling. That matters in ways passengers rarely see. Frost can cling where it shouldn't. Holdover times for de-icing can expire mid-queue, and a runway that looks merely damp can behave like a different surface entirely. On a single runway field like Gatwick, 26L the day's workhorse, every shift in friction, visibility, or wind is magnified by the relentless cadence of departures. Crews feel it as a low-grade pressure. Push on time, taxi at pace, be ready when cleared. The payoff is punctuality. The price is that every variable has less space to breathe. G-VCED wore the teal and white livery that once defined British package holidays, a promise painted on aluminum. In the forward galley, flight attendants did their quiet arithmetic. Infant life vests counted and recounted, exit rows double briefed, the mental map of who might freeze or bolt if the cabin turned loud. From L1, a view across the apron showed de-icing rigs, finishing with a 757 and a 737 waiting 2 stands over. The nozzle hiss carried on the cold air. Near the nose gear, the aircraft's short, neat registration stenciled on the doors. ED was a mechanic's and pilot's visual shorthand for identity in a sea of lookalikes. On the flight deck, the ambience would have felt steady, procedural. The captain and first officer ran checklists that reduced complexity to cadence. Batteries and beacons, flight management initialization, performance figures computed against the morning's weight and weather. The A320's screens were familiar constellations, PFDs and NDs, engine tapes waiting to rise, ECAM pages clean. Out the windscreen, Gatwick's south terminal fingered into the gloaming like a ship's pier. At their backs, 180 or so holidaymakers had settled into the low rumble of the APU, oblivious to the algebra of weight, thrust, and runway length being solved for them. The stakes on a January departure are set by physics, not itinerary. A full load of passengers and fuel pushes an A320 toward the higher end of its takeoff weight envelope, which in turn narrows margins if the runway is damp or the air dense with moisture. Add the choreography of slot control. Miss your window and you wait, and the eye stays on the clock as much as on the clouds. For ground crews, the stakes are tactile. The texture under boot when guiding a pushback. The bite of tires on paint. The sensation that a morning like this can turn slick without looking it. By the time G-VCED's doors thumped shut and the jetway pulled, the airport around it was in full flow. A 747 taxied past like a slow-moving county, orange wigwags glinting. A commuter turboprop bobbed on its gear in a gust. The Airtours flight edged back, tug lights blinking, engines waking to a sequence of whir, clack, and controlled surge. The cabin lights dipped. The familiar announcement about a short taxi and a quick flight to warmer air raised a reassuring murmur. At the threshold, runway edge lights were still biting blue in the half-light, centerline lamps leading away into vapor. It was, by all appearances, a morning built for routine. And yet anyone who has flown winter charters out of Gatwick will recognize the thinness of that word. Routine is contingent. It assumes the de-ice holds, the wind behaves, the data matches the day. It assumes that crews and machines share the same picture at the same second. As G-VCED inched toward its spot in the queue, it carried not just the expectation of an on-time departure, but the layered complexity of a highly automated jet in a busy, weather-pinched system. To understand how close routine can sit to rupture, we need to know who was at the controls, what aircraft they were flying, and the operating culture that framed their decisions. Airtours International in 2000 was the British charter industry in concentrated form. Lean schedules, high utilization, and a promise to lift entire holiday seasons on time. Its A320 fleet worked the short and medium-haul corridors from bases that included Gatwick and Manchester. The airplanes turned swiftly for morning waves to the Canaries, Mediterranean, and Red Sea. Safety lay under the same roof as punctuality. The airline lived under the United Kingdom's CAA oversight and JAR OPS rules that dictated everything from crew duty hours to minimum cabin staffing. Within that framework, Airtours cultivated a procedural culture, SOPs laminated and dog-eared, simulator sessions heavy on abnormal drills, and a practical respect for winter. Contamination checks, de-icing briefings, and a habit of talking through, what if we stop, before, what if we go? The aircraft at the heart of this story, an Airbus A320-231, belongs to a generation that recast how pilots and automation divide labor. 231 tells insiders the jet is powered by IAE V2500 engines, controlled by dual-channel FADEC, responding to thrust-lever detents rather than the movable throttles of older designs. The A320's fly-by-wire system mediates every control input through flight control computers, enforcing protections against stalls, overspeed, and excessive bank. On the panel, the ECAM sorts alerts by priority and lists the responses, reducing memory items to crisp lines on a screen. The philosophy, what Airbus calls the dark cockpit, assumes that silence and blank enunciators mean normal. When the system speaks up, the crew is meant to listen. That philosophy was mature by 2000, but not without nuance. Airbus pilots work in managed and selected modes, tell the flight management and guidance system where to go and at what altitude, and it will manage speed and path. Pull a knob and you assert a specific heading or vertical mode. The autothrust, armed by placing the levers in a fixed detent, commands engine output while the levers remain still. It's elegant and efficient, yet it demands a disciplined mental model. Which mode did we ask for? Which mode did we get? And is the aircraft doing what we think? On a cold, busy morning, that cognitive loop shares space with operational pressure, radio calls, and the sensory cues of a slick runway and an aircraft heavy with fuel and people. Airtours crews in that era were products of both worlds, analog instincts honed on earlier types, digital fluency drilled on the A320. Typical pairings put a seasoned captain with a first officer accumulating hours on type, both current in the company's winter operations program. Cabin staff, often 5 on a full A320, were trained under the same procedural rigor, with specific emphasis on rapid communication from flight deck to aisle when a normal takeoff becomes anything else. They worked to predictable checklists, but were encouraged to speak up. Post-1990s CRM made that not just acceptable, but required. The atmosphere in the cockpit before any departure reflected these habits. Roles were clear: pilot flying, pilot monitoring, sterile cockpit below 10,000 feet. Cross-checks were routine rather than ritual. FMS route verified against the cleared SID, runway and QNH confirmed. Performance data computed with contamination factors and anti-ice penalties if applicable. The captain's brief set the tone: runway in use, initial climb altitude, noise abatement, abort criteria. In winter, that brief typically included holdover times for de-ice fluid and a plain language agreement. We'll reject for any red ECAM, any significant directional control issue, any failure before V1 we can't instantly classify. Inside Airtours, punctuality mattered, but performance calculations mattered more. The company employed standardized tools for reduced thrust takeoffs and had clear stop-go policies that mirrored UK industry practice. They embraced data monitoring. Quick access recorders fed de-identified trend reports that caught unstable approaches and rushed checklists long before regulators asked. The message to line pilots was consistent: make the slot if you can, but if the numbers or the cues don't add up, take the hit and live to explain it. So when G-VCED's doors closed and the checklists ticked down, it did so with a crew steeped in Airbus logic and a company culture that prized adherence over improvisation. Their airplane was designed to surface problems quickly and guide responses methodically. Their training made aviate, navigate, communicate more than a cliché. What happened next rested on how those pieces meshed in real time, through pushback, de-icing choices, the taxi out, and the math of getting a heavy jet off a winter runway. To understand why the routine began to fray, we need to reconstruct those final minutes from stand to lineup step by step. Pushback began on schedule, the tug's amber beacons strobing across the A320's skin as the headset man gave the captain a thumbs up and the chocks came clear. Inside the cockpit, the flow was as familiar as a well-rehearsed sonata. Beacon on, doors confirmed, hydraulics in the right places, and an eye on the Airtours printer for the final signed load sheet. The numbers arrived within seconds. 0 fuel weight in line with expectations for a full cabin and holiday baggage. Fuel on board to clear the SID and allow for contingency holding. And a takeoff weight that nudged the upper middle of the aircraft's envelope for the morning's conditions. In the back, the forward galley's coffee jugs clicked into their mounts. In the aisle, cabin crew walked the last rows with practiced smiles, seatbelts and bags drawn into compliance. De-icing decisions had been taken earlier at the stand. The captain's walk-around found a dusting of hoar frost on the wing upper surfaces, the kind that looks harmless to the untrained eye and is anything but. Airtours' winter playbook was unambiguous. No lingering contamination. A Type 1 fluid application washed the frost clean, the orange sheen quickly running clear as the wing warmed under the heated mix. There was no active precipitation, and the temperature sat just below freezing. The calculus favored a simple removal, rather than a layered anti-ice coat that could complicate performance numbers. Still, the crew logged start and completion times, a mental bookmark. If queuing stretched unexpectedly, they would recheck the wings for refreeze before committing to the runway. Engine starts came in sequence, right then left. The V2500 spooling from a dry whine to a contained growl. With the tug clear and the after-start checks complete, the aircraft rolled onto the inner taxiway, nose wheel obedient under tiller, anti-ice selected on, to keep the engine nacelle lips warm against the chilled, moist air. Gatwick ground fanned a steady stream of clearances, and the A320 joined the procession toward holding point S, a line of navigation lights drifting through breath-white exhaust. ATC's cadence hinted at the morning's tempo. Continue taxi, expect immediate departure. The sort of phrasing pilots hear as both invitation and nudge. Performance work rode in parallel with the taxi. Using company tables and the day's runway condition report, damp, not contaminated, the crew computed V speeds and thrust settings with the usual caveats. Flaps were set for takeoff at a setting that balanced climb performance with rotation characteristics on a heavy jet. Auto brake was armed to max for a high-speed reject, standard for a winter departure. Flex temperature offered a margin on the engines, but the brief acknowledged a simple rule. If acceleration felt anything less than crisp, they would push to toga without debate. The wind was light from the north, a crosswind component well within limits, but the captain noted it aloud. On a slick runway, even a gentle shove can translate curiously through the nose wheel and rudder. The taxi paused twice, once for a 737 rolling out, and once for a de-icing rig trundling across a service road, and each pause was a data point. The holdover clock remained generous in the absence of precipitation. More importantly, a quick glance back down the wing from the flight deck confirmed a clean, dark surface. A revised load sheet pinged in. 2 last-minute gate-checked bags had made it aboard, which shaved and shifted the balance by a negligible amount. The first officer folded the page and recalculated. The speed tape references moved by a knot or two, more reassurance than change. At the holding point, the takeoff brief ran its winter variant one last time. Reject criteria spoken calmly, any red ECAM or major system failure before decision speed, any loss of directional control, any significant engine anomaly. After that speed, they'd continue, unless the airplane told them plainly otherwise. The plan was for a standing start, a beat on the brakes to let the engines stabilize, letting the auto thrust bite cleanly rather than asking it to catch up on a rolling entry. The cabin call chimed in on cue. Cabin secure. Flight attendants strapped in, interphone cradled, passengers tugged at belts, some tilting heads toward the window as the runway widened into view. Line up and wait, Tower said. Then within seconds, cleared for takeoff. The A320 turned onto the center line, runway edge lights receding in white perspective, a thin glaze of damp between rubber marks. The thrust levers went forward into the detent, engine instruments alive and symmetrical. The ECAM takeoff memo, showing the satisfying absence of blue. The captain's hand hovered where it always did at this moment, ready for a firm decision either way. In the next breath, subtle cues would matter more than any printed number. Acceleration felt through the seat rails, a hint of drift, the way engine tapes rose. That is where the plan began to encounter reality, and where a routine morning was seconds from demanding a split-second call. The first seconds of the takeoff roll felt normal enough to lull even a vigilant crew. Thrust levers went into the flex detent. The flight mode annunciator showed what they expected: man flex, SRS, RWI, and the engines rose toward their targets in a smooth left-right symmetry. The captain's hand rested lightly on the thrust levers, the first officers on the side stick, eyes dancing between the centerline lamps and the growing green of the speed tapes. Thrust set, the monitoring pilot called, not quite as crisply as on some mornings, but within the band of ordinary variation. The aircraft released its initial lethargy and began to build speed. Then the edges of the picture didn't sit right. Acceleration felt slightly shallow, the seat of the pants metric that comes with long habit, a sense that the runway was slipping under them more slowly than the math would predict. A nibble of right yaw crept into the rudder pedals, small but persistent, and the centerline lights seemed to migrate a shade left in the windscreen as the captain fed in corrective pressure. A glance at the engine displays showed a thin split. The right V2500 a point or two behind the left, the rate of rise less eager. No ECAM warning, no red or amber to seize their attention, just an airplane that appeared to be doing the job with a touch of reluctance. Experience sharpens to a point in moments like that. The first speed check approached and the call came, 100 knots, but the words shared space with the captain's quiet inventory. Centerline, engine symmetry, acceleration. Gatwick's damp surface was not a factor the calculations ignored. Neither was anti-ice, accounted for in the thrust setting. Yet the cues layered in a way that didn't resolve. The monitoring pilot said what training scripts teach as both observation and prompt. Check thrust. The captain scanned once more. No caution, no warning. But the right engine's N1 lagging a shade. The yaw unchanged. The next commitment on the script would be V1. Beyond that, the threshold for rejecting moves rapidly out of reach. The call, when it came, was flat and decisive. Stop. Thrust levers to idle, reversers deployed, spoilers sprang. The auto brake on max did its work. The aircraft settled visibly as lift dumped. The thrum of the engine swapped for the thunder of airflow reversed, and the shudder of anti-skid pulsing through the brake stacks. The first officer raised his eyes from the tapes to the world outside. centerline steady, runway remaining adequate, and began the cadence that takes doubt out of an already made decision. Spoilers up, reverse green, decel. The captain kept the jet straight, feet alive on the pedals, a modulated squeeze on the side stick to let weight find the wheels. Tires smoked lightly as speed bled away. The cabin felt the anchoring tug that makes conversation stop in mid-sentence. Tower, hearing the surge of reverse and sensing the intent, gave room. Stop on the runway if you need. Fire service notified. The reply was succinct. The first officer on the radio, while the captain flew the deceleration to a halt, rejecting takeoff, remaining on the runway. There was no hint of panic on either end. Gatwick knows what a rejected takeoff looks and sounds like. The orange vehicles in the infield rolled into position as a precaution, not a verdict. The airplane came to a stop with comfortable pavement to spare. Parking brake set. Reversers stowed. The captain took a breath, eyes back to the displays. The ECAM remained blank of new sins, the engines now idling with textbook symmetry as if withdrawing their earlier reluctance. The monitoring pilot opened the overhead to check packs and bleeds in case an odd bleed configuration had shaved available thrust. Nothing obvious. If there had been a definitive fault, it had hidden behind the subtlety of a split and a feel. In that ambiguity lies a professional's operating margin. When the picture does not cohere and the runway ahead is still generous, you keep the aircraft on the ground. Inside the cabin, the physics of the stop translated into something more visceral. Bodies braced by belts, coffee cups lifting, a child's cry broken off and then swallowed by silence. To prevent that silence turning to speculation, cockpit and cabin had to connect quickly and clearly. The captain reached for the interphone. The senior flight attendant's hand was already on the handset. What she heard in the next few seconds would determine the tone of the cabin and the choreography that followed, whether to prepare to evacuate, to stay put, or to breathe and wait. The interphone clicked and the senior flight attendant heard the captain's voice clipped and calm. "We've rejected the takeoff. No fire, no immediate danger. Remain seated. Stand by." It was a 20-word transfer of authority that set the tone. She lowered the handset and the cabin became a stage for muscle memory. For the previous minutes, each attendant had been in silent review, eyes open but mind rehearsing. Which exit is mine? What commands do I shout? Who will help? What will I block? The stop turned that rehearsal into action. From the forward jump seat came a firm, rhythmic command that carried through the fuselage. "Heads down! Stay down!" The same cadence answered from the rear, a call and response that told passengers this was planned, not panic. A rejected takeoff at high speed feels different from a hard landing. The deceleration loads people into their belts. Loose items surge, then tumble. In 12A, a plastic cup skittered into the aisle. A few rows back, a toddler's cry cut off as the aircraft settled. The attendants stayed locked in their harnesses until the jet stopped. The moment inertia surrendered, their choreography changed. The forward pair stayed at their doors, scanning through the porthole for hazards. Smoke from an engine, flames under a wing, a fuel sheen on the pavement. The aft attendants did the same while catching the first signs of passenger behavior. Hands itching toward overhead bins, phones lifted out of habit or nerves. "Remain seated," the number 3 repeated, palm out, voice pitched low and commanding. "Seatbelts fastened, please." Crew resource management sounds abstract until it's the only structure in the room. The senior called the cockpit back within seconds, a standard two-way check. Forward cabin normal, no smoke, no fire, standing by. The replies from the middle and rear positions followed, each a crisp status report. Aft cabin normal, one minor spill, no smoke. The captain acknowledged, promised a PA, and asked them to hold. That locked in the plan. No self-initiated evacuation. Exits assessed and guarded. Slides armed. Passengers contained. The door checks continued in a quiet loop. Look, listen, feel, hands ready to block if the outside world turned hostile in an instant. With smoke absent and the stop complete, reassurance mattered as much as restraint. The captain's voice filled the speaker cones. "Ladies and gentlemen, This is your captain. We have discontinued our takeoff due to an engine indication. There is no cause for alarm. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll be moving shortly." The words did their job. Shoulders dropped, a few breaths came out in laughter. The front galley attendant turned that beat of calm into practical control, walking 4 rows deep on each side to relatch bins and make eye contact. "We'll update you. Belts on, thank you." She crouched briefly to check a scald on a passenger's forearm, coffee rather than injury, and signaled the number 2 to fetch a cool compress from the demo kit. The strength of the cabin team lay in shared mental models. Everyone knew the triggers for opening a door without orders: visible fire, dense smoke, water rising, and equally the restraint required when none of those existed. They also knew the risks that come with a hasty slide deployment on a busy runway. Slides catch wind and drift. Passengers tumble or hesitate. Aircraft structures bite. So the crew focused on the controllables. Keep aisles clear, dissuade anyone from unbuckling, keep eyes outside. They walked a tightrope between firmness and warmth, the sort of balanced authority that keeps small problems from recruiting larger ones. CRM also means upward communication. If a cabin crew member had seen an orange tongue at the engine or smelt sharp, oily smoke, the next words to the cockpit would have been unambiguous: "Fire right side." In their absence, the seniors' updates stayed procedural and brief, a tempo that matched the cockpit's own diagnostic pace. When the arming lights above the doors remained steady and the cabin remained clear, she instructed her team to stay at stations. The interphone remained live, a hotline ready to reverse the entire plan on a syllable. There were subtler duties in those minutes that rarely make manuals. One attendant engaged 3 teenagers starting to stand, channeling energy into a task. "Phones away, guys. You can help me with those loose bags once we park." Another leaned into a nervous flyer, offered the calibration of reality. "This feels dramatic, but the pilots did exactly the right thing. We'll be fine." Authority spreads efficiently when it's modeled rather than shouted. When the engines wound down to a steadier note and the compressor's whine eased, the cabin listened as if to a living thing breathing. That sound, too, was information. No roaring fire, no irregular surges, no fumes building in the air. The captain came back on. "We'll be assisted by the airport services. We'll advise you of our next steps. Cabin crew, stand by." The attendants translated that into a cabin script that prioritized predictability. "We're staying seated until we're told otherwise. If we move, we will tell you exactly what to do. Keep the aisles clear." In the end, the cabin's job in a rejected takeoff is to hold the line between instinct and action, to keep order until a new plan arrives. That morning, the order held. Outside, a different choreography was already underway. Tower calls, rerouting traffic, a runway inspection sprinting toward the A320, and Gatwick's fire and rescue aligning for a close look at G-VCED's tires and engines. What happened beyond the windows would shape whether the aircraft taxied off under its own power or waited out a longer, more public drama. From the tower cab, the first sign that the Airtours A320 was no longer a routine departure was the bloom of reverse thrust echoing along the pavement. The controller had already cleared the jet for takeoff. Now the cadence shifted to containment. Stop bars at the runway entries went red. Vehicles were warned to hold position, and the approach controller upstream was told to build space. Airtours 27, Roger rejecting, stop where you are. The tower frequency carried, calm and clipped. On the ground frequency, pushbacks were halted. Intersection departures were told to hold. The single runway geometry of Gatwick makes any interruption a visible event. Within seconds, an arriving narrowbody on a 3-mile final was instructed to go around. The climb-out added to a holding stack to the south. Departures became a queue of running lights, paused. The airport's fire and rescue service rolled by rote. They had watched the takeoff, and they know the difference between a reduced thrust surge and the hard note of reversers at speed. The duty officer keyed his radio with the template phrase that unlocks a practiced plan: local standby. Yellow and red appliances angled toward pre-assigned access points. their drivers threading service roads at a brisk but measured pace. They paused at holding points, waiting for clearance to enter. Foam remained capped. There was no smoke, no flame, and no point in making a mess of a runway without clear cause. One operations pickup, the runway inspection unit, took position a safe distance behind the stopped aircraft to watch for shimmering heat off the brakes and to scan for any debris, or worse, a trail of rubber that would suggest locked wheels or a blown tire. On the frequency, the exchange favored brevity. Gatwick Tower to Fire 1, A320, rejected takeoff, no fire reported. Hold short, be prepared to follow. Fire 1, Roger. The controller asked the crew the critical question. Were they able to vacate? The first officer's answer was non-committal and professional. They needed a minute to assess brake temperatures and systems. The A320's own display would tell that story with numbers. On the ground, the rescue team's infrared imagers would double-check once they were closer. Until then, the safest place for everyone was exactly where the airplane sat. Brakes set, engines decelerating, and traffic kept well away. In the terminals, the ripple was quantifiable. A few extra minutes of runway closure and a peak bank translates to missed calculated takeoff times down the line. Ramp controllers began swapping departure slots like chess moves, airline dispatchers phoned for revised flow management times, and a supervisor's log picked up a string of delay codes that would later be apportioned to ATC reactionary and safety. Out on the apron, a stand guidance system flicked from green to red as a 757 destined for departure, in the same wave was told to hold at gate. The quick-turn ground team retreated a step to avoid working in vain against an uncertain picture. When the rescue appliances were cleared onto the runway, they approached without drama, parking offset from each main gear by design. The lead firefighter gave the thumbs up to the flight deck after a slow 360-degree look. No smoke, no leaks, nothing visually wrong beyond the understandable funk of hot brakes. The tower relayed the clearance to vacate whenever ready, with the caveat to keep speed to a crawl and follow the vehicles. The captain brought the A320 to life again. Reversers stowed, a whisper of thrust to get rolling, the airplane shepherded off at the next exit. The convoy slid past, the engine's breath visible in the January air, and the runway inspection unit moved in to walk the center line. Inspection after a high-energy stop is not optional. Skid marks tell stories. So do patches of rubber and streaks of Type 1 de-icing residue. The operations pickup traced the rollout path, pausing to chalk a spot where the anti-skid had worked hard, then drove the length of the runway to check for dropped metal or a dislodged panel. The verdict came back quickly. Surface serviceable. The controller reopened the runway in steps. First arrival cleared to land, then departures released one at a time to rebuild cadence. The first arrival, a domestic shuttle, touched down with barely a minute's margin on its new spacing, a visible confirmation that the system had absorbed the shock. The Airtours jet, meanwhile, was tucked onto a remote stand, ringed by amber lights. Fire and rescue watched the brake temperatures stair-step down, while engineering trucks pulled in beside them. For airport operations, the immediate emergency was over, but the operational aftershocks would last through the morning. A half-dozen departures now out of sequence, inbound connections strained, crew duty clocks ticking closer to limits. A runway, once closed, takes time to give back the minutes it borrowed. All of that was the public face of the event. The choreography of caution that passengers could see from their windows and other airlines could count in their departure boards. Inside the A320's computers and on the tower's tapes was a quieter record. The exact second the thrust split emerged, the speed when the stop call came, the deceleration profile down to the knot. To understand the choice the crew made and the subtlety of the cues they acted on, we need to lay that data out second by second and hear the cockpit as it happened. What the passengers felt as a hard, confident stop. The recorders caught in granular detail. The quick access recorder sampled dozens of parameters. The cockpit voice recorder overlaid them with human cadence. Built together, they chart a morning that stayed inside normal until very quickly it didn't. Brake release to thrust application was almost instantaneous. At +1 second, the levers were placed into the flex detent. The flight mode annunciator carried the expected man flex SRS RWI. By plus 4 seconds, engine parameters stabilized near target, and the monitoring pilot's thrust set landed on the tape. Acceleration tracked close to the book, firm but not exuberant, showing a rate that, on paper, would have made the decision speed achievable with margin. At plus 7, a small rudder input registered as the airplane asked for left pedal to counter a rightward tendency. The centerline trace, derived from nose-wheel steering and inertial sensors, remained tight. By plus 9 seconds, a split crept into the engine indications. It wasn't dramatic. One side lagged the other by a fraction, a wobble that a casual glance might write off to instrument jitter. The CVR caught the first officer doing what good monitoring sounds like without drama: check thrust. The captain's acknowledgement was wordless but audible in the scan sounds. Breath, a click, the brief pause before the next call-out. At plus 14, the 100 knots call arrived on cue, and the acceleration curve had flattened by a degree that would only show itself later in graphs. The auto-thrust logic did not complain. No ECAM, no chime, just the arithmetic of energy, building a little more slowly than feel expected. Between plus 15 and plus 20, the yaw demand steadied instead of fading, while the speed tape continued upward. The engine split persisted, small but unclosing. Inside that 5-second span sits the choice. The CVR records no exclamation, no overlap of voices. The captain waited for one more beat to ensure the sensation wasn't a gust, a patch of damp rubber, or his own caution, and then made the call that has saved more crews than it has ever embarrassed. At approximately plus 21 before V1, a single level command: stop. The sequence that followed was a choreography almost as automated as Airbus intended, only executed by people. The thrust levers came to idle, reverser levers lifted, the ground spoilers deployed. The FDR shows spoiler panels rising within a heartbeat of lever movement. The auto brake and max set the baseline deceleration. The captain added what he needed with firm, modulated pedal pressure. The CVR captured the call-outs that turn a complex machine into a single-purpose object. Spoilers up, reverse green, decel. Brake pressure bars climbed. The deceleration trace became a clean slope. At plus 35, the speed passed through roughly 60 knots. The reversers came back toward idle to avoid ingesting debris. At plus 42 to 45 seconds, the ground speed decayed to 0. The parking brake clicked on. The primary flight display, indifferent to the drama, slipped back to stillness. After the stop, the cockpit audio moved to diagnosis. The first officer radioed the tower. The captain's scan returned to the engine screens and the wheel page. No ECAM alert populated, a fact as telling as any warning might have been. Brake temperatures rose as they always do after a high-energy stop, peaking minutes later, not seconds. The crew cross-checked packs and bleeds. Bleed configurations can steal thrust on a cold morning, but found nothing out of place. If there was an anomaly, it was encoded in subtle asymmetry and feel rather than in a line item. The QAR allowed investigators to measure what the crew sensed. The acceleration deficit was real, small but present. The engine parameters split, transient and uncommanded, began within 10 seconds of brake release, and never closed completely before the reject. Rudder deflection data mapped to the yaw report in the captain's memory. Notably, the recordings showed no bounce in thrust lever position, no inadvertent movement out of the detent. The auto-thrust commanded what it was asked to. The stop occurred a safe distance below decision speed, with runway remaining that made the choice conservative rather than desperate. If you seek a smoking gun in these traces, there isn't one. What emerges instead is a portrait of a crew acting inside a thin slice of uncertainty. Enough cues to question, not enough time to explain. In the paperwork that followed, the defect logs, maintenance actions, and operational reports, the most uncomfortable element is how easily those small mismatches can be smoothed by language and process. Before we weigh those forms and what they chose to emphasize or omit, it's worth sitting with the paradox the data reveals. A modern system working as designed, and a human decision that had to overrule it in real time.